please. Has science killed off God?
I'd love to help you with this question. I think the first thing to say when we're thinking about has science killed off God is what is science? And the first thing I want to say is this. I went to university to study science. That's why I went to university in part. Science is amazing. It helps people. It alleviates suffering. It's interesting. It's elegant sometimes. It's life enhancing. It's beautiful. It's exciting. It's creative. And maybe a bit humbling too, as we realize how big the universe is or how massive the nanosphere is. Science is worth investing in. It's a serious search for truth and reality. I love science, and I think that Christians and all human beings ought to really value and be excited about science. That's the first thing. Second thing is that there are different views about how much science can achieve and explain. Some people, like the Oxford chemist Peter Atkins, think that science will one day be able to explain everything, literally everything. Others, such as Richard Dawkins' hero, the late Nobel Prize-winning biologist Sir Peter Medawar, take a different view to Atkins. This is what Peter Medawar, Dawkins' hero, wrote: that there is a limit upon science is made likely by the existence of questions that science can't answer, and no conceivable change or advance in science would empower it to answer. These questions are the questions that children ask, the ultimate questions of Karl Popper. How did everything begin? What are we all here for? What's the point of living? So when it comes to explaining the world and solving problems like human nature, our mortality, that each of us will one day not be here, and answering some of the big questions of life, there are different opinions. Peter Atkins on one side and Medawar on the other. There are different opinions about how far science will take us down that road. Science actually derives its power from its limitations, and it focuses with incredible intensity on particular types of questions and subject matter, particular things that are themselves open, they fall open to that type of investigation. In other words, we can observe them and look at them in that type of way with that kind of lens. But there are actually lots of questions and issues and subject matter which are not open to that method of investigation. They're still open to investigations, just maybe not scientific ones. Maybe we need other tools. Science focuses on particular types of questions and particularly things that are able to be repeatable. But where else could we look outside of science? We might start with philosophy, with movies, with literature, with music, with religion, with history, with theology, with literature, stories, or just our everyday experiences of life, what it's like to be in love, what it's like to feel pain, what it's like to contemplate being human. Perhaps it's also here that we need to look for answers to the difficult and big questions of life. There's a philosopher called Alvin Plantinga, and before you roll your eyes, let me tell you a story that he tells that illustrates the point we're making here. Imagine you're walking down a dark street. You turn a corner and you see a drunk man looking for something. He doesn't look threatening. He's looking for something on the ground under a very bright lamppost in the dark. And you ask him, "What are you looking for?" "I'm looking for my keys. I've lost my keys somewhere here. Will you help me find them?" So you start helping him to look and looking for the keys. You can't find them. They're not there in the pool of light under the lamppost. And so you say to him, "Are you sure you lost your keys here under this lamppost?" And he says, "No, I'm not sure where I lost them at all. It's just here under the lamppost is where the light is brightest." Now, to think that science is the only way of reaching the truth is to think that you can only find your keys under the lamppost. Peter Atkins would say, it's not just that science shines a very bright light, but there are just no keys outside that pool of light. But what do you think? How might this work? Well, I think there sometimes can be a temptation to say that you either use a scientific way of investigating the world, or you're not talking about anything real, you're being stupid. Imagine you want to get married. Let me ask you, how do you go about picking the right person or making that decision to get married? Is the way you make that decision either using science or this sort of crazy, irrational, stupid way where you just choose something randomly? Is there another way to investigate between science and between that? There clearly are irrational ways of choosing somebody to get married to. Imagine you walk out of the studio, or you walk out of wherever you're listening to this, you park the car perhaps, or stop doing whatever you're doing, and you decide to walk down the road, and you're going to ask the first person you meet to marry you. That's a pretty crazy way to decide how to get married or who to get married to. It would be even more terrifying if the person you asked said yes, I suppose. But is there a way, a rational way of investigating the world and its questions without using science? How could you do that in a thoughtful, careful, evidence-based, but still logical way? How could you do that? But if you couldn't necessarily use science to do it, well, of course, you get to know the person, you see if you're compatible, you hang out together, you go on dates to places like IKEA, not such a great first date for me, that one. Then you take her on your motorbike. Well, that fixed things a little bit for me. And you really talk, you examine and you think about your relationship, your passions, your beliefs, and you ask people that you trust, what's your feeling about this? What's your sense about us as a couple? Do you think we're compatible? So I wasn't able to have any scientific certainty before I knew that my wife Caroline was a great match for me. Maybe I should have designed some repeatable experiments, but that would be pretty crazy, because there are big aspects of what it's like to be married that were completely inaccessible to me. They weren't open to me until I was married. And so Caroline and I carefully and we rationally considered the decision beforehand. Yes, we're in love. Yes, we wanted to be together, but we were thinking about it carefully with evidence as well, and with reason and wisdom. So we would say we used faith and reason, not faith or reason. So I think we do this all the time, Gareth. I think we say, when we're starting a new job, when we're choosing what to study, when we're buying a new car, when you're getting something from eBay, when you're starting a new relationship or a new school or a new, whatever you're doing, I think that if we take on this sort of attitude where we have to have scientific evidence or we just leap in, I don't think we think like that. Instead, there's evidence that we look at, faith and reason, not faith or reason. It's very interesting to think that actually those of us who are Christians would probably say this is quite similar to the sort of way that we might put our trust in God and open up to a real, living, loving relationship with him.
It's really interesting, and some questions coming through here as well, if we can put them to you. So first of all, Kimberly has been in touch to say, well, actually, it's true what Tom has said, because if you've ever seen the programme Married at First Sight, it's when scientists get together, they've got pictures, and they do almost, I suppose you could call it, a scientific experiment, and they say that this person will be perfect for that one. And if you've watched it, without doing too much of a spoiler, it doesn't tend to work. And the next question is from Eric, and he said, it's an interesting idea about the lamppost. Couldn't you argue that the lamppost with the light is the obvious place to start with first of all, because it's got the light? Therefore, does that not say that science should be the first place to start looking?
Yeah, I think there's something to that, actually, that the tools that we most immediately have to investigate the world are those scientific tools. The other thing to bring in, Eric, is that we're not just in the dark in terms of the other space there, because there's spillover light. So, you're going to see, if you just stand outside the pool of light, it's going to look like the only place you can see anything. But if you stand outside the light a little bit, maybe with a foot half in and half out, you're going to actually see that there's a blend of grays. Your eyes are going to become accustomed to the light, and you're going to pick up tools to look at other areas as well. So it's not an either or necessarily. I think it's a both and. We look at our own experience, we look at literature, we look at the different elements around us at the same time as we're using science. There's also the notion here, that the idea here that God's revealed himself. It's not just that we're looking, but that God is actually seeking. He's coming into the light to say, I'm doing things in history, I'm revealing things, and you can use the tools of science. One example might be using archaeological science to be able to investigate whether or not the things recorded about me are true or not. So I think I'd start there. I mean, the other thing to say is that the very premise of science, you can't actually start with science. The very premise of science itself is itself based on philosophy and based on ideas. And those ideas may have their grounding or may flow from theology. So, for example, science can't demonstrate its own method. The scientific method itself is a philosophical method. It's not itself, strictly speaking, a science. You can't prove the method of repeatable experiments being a guide to truth using science. So we're already starting with outside of the circle to some extent. So I think as long as we're aware of those groundings, that we can't demonstrate various different things, that, for example, our minds are seeking truth, really seeking truth, rather than what's a genetic advantage to us. Final point here would be that science also opens up questions. Science opens up things, and we see things with science that then cause us to ask, gosh, we might need to look and zoom out a bit further to get an explanation. For example, the way in which with science we've discovered the fine-tuning of the cosmological constants of the universe, the very, very finely balanced constants that were related to the formation and expansion of the universe in the Big Bang, that actually do indicate to some degree that we need to look at what possibilities there are before the Big Bang.
I suppose it's the idea as well, and I've heard this used a few times, that if you see a cake, science or the instructions, it can tell you how the cake was made. You use 3 eggs, how many eggs it is. I don't do much baking, but it wouldn't tell you why the cake was made. You would have to go and ask Aunt Polly why she made the cake.
That's exactly right. I mean, another illustration of the same point could be, imagine I see you, Gareth, walking down the road, and I put the kettle on. You walk down the road towards my house, and you bang on the front door, and I open the front door, and you say, oh, how are you doing? And I invite you in, and you walk into the kitchen and you say, why is the kettle boiling? And I say, well, charge is moving through the wires, it's moving through the electrical heating element, that's warming up, that's causing a phase change, and the water is turning to steam, and that's the boiling that you see. Well, I've described the mechanism, the how of what's happening. I haven't actually given you the reason why the kettle's boiling on one level as well. It's because I saw you walking up the road. Would you like a cup of tea? So we shouldn't think that because we've offered a scientific explanation for something that we've exhausted that event, that happening, that area of all of its meaning. It could be we explain the how, but the why is another order of meaning that may also be true at the same time.